Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're tuning in from. Hello. I'm really excited to be speaking and to introduce Dr. Josef Witt-Doerrin, who is a distinguished board certified psychiatrist with a really unique blend of expertise and experience, which I'm excited to get into with you all. Dr. Josef is a former FDA medical officer and has dedicated his career to the field of psychiatry with a particular focus on helping his patients safely discontinue psychiatric meds. His work is grounded in a deep understanding of both the clinical and the regulatory aspects of psychiatric treatments. His approach is patient-centered and it really emphasizes safe and effective strategies for medication discontinuation and is informed by his extensive knowledge of the pharmaceutical industry and regulatory processes. Dr. Josef his commitment to his patients and his field has made him a respected voice in psychiatry, particularly in the area of medication management and withdrawal. So he's here joining us. Morning, Josef. Afternoon.
Yeah, good afternoon, Jessica. Yeah.
So everyone will hear the accent. You are indeed Australian, but you are living abroad. Whereabouts in the US?
Yeah, so I'm out in St. George, Utah. So kind of on the west coast in the mountains.
Yeah, okay. I've never been there. But what led you over there? Just quickly.
Yeah, so I finished medical school, and the US always had this reputation when I was in my training of being a great place to go for specialty training. And so I went over here after med school to train, and I met my wife interviewing for internship, and the rest is history. And now I'm here for good. So that's kind of how things happened.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. And I know you've set up your own clinic over there, which we will definitely get into, because it kind of seems a little bit paradoxical to have a psychiatrist, discontinuing meds within the clinic and that being the goal, which I think is so great. So we'll get into that. But I guess, one of the reasons that I wanted to get you on here, so I listened to Dr. Josef, everyone on a podcast with Dr. Roger McFillin, and I just loved the experience in the background, and I guess the experience you had within FDA and also pharmaceutical companies. And I think that gives you a really unique lens into various worlds within this realm of medication and who we're giving it to, why we're giving it out. And so I would love everyone to understand, firstly, what had you become a psychiatrist? So, what were the intentions? What were the hopes and dreams? Why did you go down that route?
Yeah. So it's probably like a common story. You grow up and you have your own problems. And I wouldn't say I had like devastating mental health problems, but I think I really gravitated towards psychology, philosophy, self-help growing up, and I always kind of turned towards books for these answers, and that's what I was just into. And I went to medical school, always having this interest in those sciences, and I saw psychiatry as a way to continue to follow that, and that's what eventually drew me into that field. And then the field eventually kind of dashed all my hopes that they would really be that interested into those things I cared about, and that's sort of what sent me on the path to doing a lot of deep prescribing eventually.
Yeah, I can understand that. Although not psychiatry myself, but when I was in the field of social work, I started to see behind the curtain and wasn't too impressed with the results I saw. So very different fields, but they're connected in a lot of ways too. So I guess when you say it dashed your hopes and dreams, what does that mean? What does that look like to a psychiatrist in the field, seeing what you're seeing, hearing what you're hearing? How did that happen?
Sure. Yeah, so I guess you have expectations going in, and mine were that I would, that I would be entering a field where people would be having emotional problems. My gut feeling at the time was that the majority of them would be based on life hardship. I knew there were some genetic components to mental health things, especially with bipolar and schizophrenia and some types of depression, and I was accepting of that. But really what I thought was going to be most prevalent was, people suffering from problems of living. And so when I entered psychiatry, I was hoping to almost be this halfback, or in the US, we'd say quarterback, and I'd be kind of arranging different players, social workers, case managers, therapists, and we would be working to help most of these people with these life hardship problems. And then maybe judiciously, at times, we would be using medications just to give people a little extra help for the shortest amount of time that they needed it. And that was really not what I saw when I entered the field. And I'm going to be clear. I'm not saying that there's never a place for medication. I hope that's coming through. But what I did see was that at least in the places where I worked, the services were not set up in a way to actually help people with the help that they really deserved. Whether it was they were having problems in their relationships, or they had childhood trauma that was still impacting their relationship and their life. Maybe a lot of it was just issues that had to do with poverty. And so the systems in multiple places I worked were not robust. They were not set up to really help people at the root. And instead of helping them in that way, we were just giving them medications. And I actually struggled with this for a long time because, when you have problems, you usually just get a DSM diagnosis. It's based of symptoms. It's not really based on the causes. And, everything is very algorithmic in the US. I imagine it's the same in Australia. And when you get that diagnosis, you say, well, this is approved for that condition, and now you can give them a med. And so, technically doing that, was by the book, but something about that always felt wrong to me. Surely there had to be a downside of not actually helping people with the underlying issues that cause them to be depressed and just giving them meds for symptomatic treatment. And so during my training, I kind of went along and I did that, and I felt uncomfortable. And so I knew I needed to learn more about why I was feeling uncomfortable. So I became really interested in drug side effects because I wanted to understand the downside of treating people with problems of living with medications. And it turns out there were a lot of downsides. And, this is mostly what I'm known for now, is really talking about the side effects of medications, things like the protracted withdrawal injuries that happen to some people when they come off them too quickly. It's neurologically devastating. There's problems such as persistent sexual dysfunction coming off the antidepressants as well. And so I nearly wanted to quit at one point. I said, this is crazy. I can't believe that everyone is so okay, dishing out these meds. Why am I the only one that's seeing that there's a problem here? And I nearly did, but I was lucky that I had some professors who really encouraged me to go into research, and I started publishing on the topics and eventually decided I wanted to go to the FDA and become a drug safety researcher and really learn how regulators get that information into the hands of doctors. And so I did that. And then I also worked in several pharmaceutical companies as a drug safety physician. And it was kind of through the experience of being at the FDA and in the pharmaceutical companies where I eventually learned why I felt so alone when I was in my training, and why it seemed like no one was really having problems with the dispensing of the meds. And I realized that in many ways, medical education had been completely captured by commercial forces. And there's no secret evil cabal with, backdoor handshakes and things like that, but it's just a money issue. Because once drug companies get a drug on the market, obviously there's a commercial incentive to sell it, but that kind of that spills over into the publications and the literature and also the conferences. And so because there's no incentive to ever talk about the downsides of medications, they only talk about the benefits. And the effect that has when it trickles down to social workers and doctors is that the drugs are safer than they really are, and that the risks and that they have less risks than they really do. And so seeing all of that really kind of made me feel sad, because there were people out there getting harmed by these medications. And that's when me and my wife ended up starting our clinic. And so I left the pharmaceutical industry and kind of full time have started helping people who have had drug injuries and who might be on 5 or 6 different meds, and they want to come off, and so that's what I've been up to.
Yeah, and it's a
Yeah.
lot. It's a lot. And I remember when I was working as a social worker, we'd have these meetings, with various stakeholders, like the health professionals, the doctors and the teachers, parents, everyone. And we talk about, well, what medications they're on. And I remember my mindset at that time, whether the information that's trickling down to us and to me was that it just is the way to go. And if they're not on it yet, then that will be the solution. And you're really thought of poorly if it's not your first go-to, or if you want to choose something else or try something else. There is this idea or generalization that if you don't choose it, then you're bad and you're doing the child a disservice, right? There was this narrative going on, and I remember believing it. I thought, well, that is right. The meds are great. And I remember some of my social work friends, a lot of the rhetoric that they would share was, well, if you had diabetes, or you had heart disease, or you had some other medical condition, well, you would take meds for that, wouldn't you? So why wouldn't you take meds for something like mental health or some other psychiatric label or diagnoses that you're given? And I know you've probably heard that before. And so I'm wondering how do you, where does your brain go when you hear that?
I got a lot to say about those things. First is that for a long time, we were captured by a narrative that there was a chemical imbalance. That's the old one that people have talked about for a long time, and that a lot of it was overblown. That you're sure there's some genetic components to mental health problems, but for a long period now, it's we hear the chemical imbalance narrative as being really the cause of a lot of these mental illnesses, and it pops up in different forms. Sometimes people say, oh, these drugs are helping dysfunctional circuits, or they're helping stimulate neurogenesis and things like that. And so there's all these chemical things that they kind of put out there to infer that mental illness is biological, when the truth is that, it plays a small role, but the majority of mental health problems are firmly based in psychology and environment. I'm going to say something like 95% plus, and that's conservative, just from what I see, spending 10,000 hours in emergency rooms talking to people who are suicidal. And so when you kind of have this chemical imbalance way of looking at things, then it does make sense to say, hey, it's like insulin for diabetes, because with diabetes there's a known underlying dysfunction, lack of insulin, and treating the issue is really as simple as that, replacing it, and you don't have to worry about anything else. But that's not the case using psychiatric drugs for psychiatric symptoms, because it's not treating the cause. You're using the profile of a drug, the psychological profile that it causes people to experience to mask symptoms in a way. And so take the SSRIs, drugs like Prozac, they seem to have this kind of emotionally constricting effect, or a blunting effect, some may say. And that can be therapeutic for someone if they're having severe anxiety, and it might put them in a better state of mind, but it's definitely not treating the underlying issue for people. And because of that, there's collateral, and so what's some of the collateral problems that happen? Well, people they actually can feel less joy sometimes. They can feel less connected to other people. They can feel emotionally detached. And so it's a sword that cuts both ways. And rarely are the doctors who are prescribing these medications looking at them in a way where it's like, hey, we're giving you a drug to make you feel a certain way. Let's evaluate the pros and cons of that kind of drug induced state. You go in there and they just say, oh, it's for your depression, and who cares if it's made you more detached in your emotional relationships, and that's having some kind of negative effect. So that's what I would say about that.
Yeah. And so
sorry. one thing I was going to say, the other thing that you touched on was that feeling bad in training for suggesting non-drug mechanisms. And that was non-drug treatments, I meant to say. And that was something I acutely felt in my training. And it just seemed like to suggest non-drug treatments was just kind of stupid, or, they were just less effective, and why even mention them. And it really took me like 10 years to realize what was going on, because I think there's a lot of forces there. Definitely there's the fact that that's all that doctors hear about, because it's just invaded the medical literature. So people, for every one article there is on psychosocial interventions that a doctor reads, there's going to be 100 on drugs. And so you have that general effect. But the other thing that's kind of frightening, and I want people to be aware of, is that there are commercial forces at play just in the dispensing of mental health treatments. And it is a lot easier for doctors to give medications than it is to help people. And sometimes social workers and case managers and therapists are all complicit in this, because when you have really difficult patients, that's complicated. You have to deal with them after hours. You have to spend a lot of time with them. And so in a way, using medications is also very kind of an efficient way for mental health professionals to deal with crises which are uncomfortable. And so, when you only have 15 minutes in an appointment with someone, or when your therapy patient is becoming really difficult, it's a lot easier just to say, hey, we got to get you on medications. Oftentimes that's not in the best interest of the patient. It's more in the interest of being efficient for the person looking after you. And that's what I realized many years looking back was, I was kind of taught in a way to think that these therapies were worse because we never spoke about them. But the reality was actually, I think that just using medications was a lot more efficient for the providers. And so that's why we kind of doled them out so much. It's this unholy alliance going on.
Yeah. And I really hear it within the parents that I work with. So we've got school systems who are heavily on board with, the medication aspect. And I have parents asking me all of the time, Jess, my child will be suspended or expelled if I don't go along and put my child on medication. What am I meant to do? Because they don't want to provide any other solutions or think about anything, or they're struggling, or they don't have the time. So there's so many pressures, especially from a parent's perspective, in who wants my child on medication, and the fear that comes with that from a parent's view. And I guess, one of the things that I think I really want my listeners to have an understanding of from you is the inside of these worlds. So, I know you've been in the pharmaceutical industry and the FDA, and we have, you sit around, you have a coffee, you sit around a table and you chat about, the big money, or they've got so much power. And because we don't have, it seems so foreign, it seems so far away, a lot of people don't give it the value that it needs. And so what I'm curious to hear from you then is, what are these people evil at heart? Okay, so they're sitting around, they're having conversations around why we need to get this medication approved. What's their incentives? What are they in the job for? Is it that they are more interested in the money than the health and well-being of people and families and children? Or is it that they, like, you were taught in uni and you're learning, and, mine too sometimes, and other practitioners, that this is the model that works best for people, right? So they're hearing this on a daily basis. It's almost like that propaganda view of what's going to work. What's happening behind closed doors in those environments?
This is a hard question for me to answer. I'm going to try and kind of break it down into a really digestible way that will hopefully seem relatable to your listeners. And this is also coming from a place where I have a lot of friends who are in the FDA, and also I have mentors and people who have really been kind to me and quite lovely in these companies. So I'm going to try to give the most honest account of what's happening there. First thing I'm going to say is, it can be difficult to do something truthful or something that is right when your job depends on it. And so there are always these pressures. And so when I look back at my time in the pharmaceutical company, one thing I'll have to say is I want to make a clear distinction. So the FDA and the pharmaceutical companies really, I'm going to say they do a good job at listing the side effects of the drug when the drug makes it to the market, because it's a regulatory mandate. They run these big trials and they have to list all the drugs and the side effects and the frequencies, and they put it in the label. And so that information is all there. However, that is where things tend to stop, because once the TGA or the FDA has the label out there with all the risks, they're not really invested at all in getting that information out to the public. Okay, so the drug company at that point has fulfilled their regulatory mandate to list the side effects discovered during the clinical trials, and they sit in drug labels, and doctors may or may not read them, and patients may or may not see them. But after that, and the drug is on the market, then marketing takes over. And the purpose of the marketing department in pharmaceutical companies is to make sure that doctors have the most favorable perspective of the drugs possible. And so, these companies, they send people to conferences to talk about the new drugs. They publish articles that address the concerns that physicians have in the community, and they're always skewed to present the drug in the best way possible. That's just business. And so I think what happens is, when the drug is on the market, there's no watchdog, there's no government agency saying, hey, you guys, you really need to send just as many people to conferences to talk about the risks of the drug, and you really need to publish just as many articles, touting the negative, describing the negative effects as are touting the benefits. But that's just not what any regulators do. So you get this massive skewing. And now, when I remember being in the pharmaceutical company and I was working on the safety profile of some drugs, we would, within the drug safety division, we'd be having these ideas and saying things like, hey, we really want to publish this safety paper. We know that this drug is causing, reproductive problems in women, and we want to put out a great publication so the physicians can talk to them about it. Oftentimes we got shut down, and we would have people coming to us, higher up, saying, you know what, we've already described this in the label. We don't want to make a bigger deal out of this than it is. And honestly, that was just good business practices from the executives in the company, because they've been hired to kind of navigate the corporate seas and get the drug to sell as much as possible. So that's how I think a lot of the skewing happens. It's that there's just a commercial agenda to sell things. And should some of these people in the pharmaceutical companies have felt really bad about that, and are they evil? There's something bad about it. I don't think that they think that they're bad people. I think that they end up in a place where it's just like, well, this stuff's already described in the label, so if people really want to look at it, they could just go find it there. But at the same time, their microphone and everything that they're putting out there is only on the positive. So there's also this sense, I think, that, hey, if Eli Lilly and Pfizer and all of these people are doing it this way, if we don't do it this way, then people are going to get the impression that our drug is, more dangerous than theirs, and share price is going to drop. We're going to have to fire people, and yeah. So that's, I think it's just business, really, and as nasty as that is to say, because I know people are getting massively hurt and are losing decades of their lives because they ended up getting on drugs that they shouldn't have been on in the first place. At the end of the day, it's just business forces.
Yeah. And how are they getting approved? So how do drugs get approved?
Yeah, so in the US, you need 2 randomized controlled trials typically. So they get a very pure population of the patients, whether it's ADHD or depression, and then they give them a placebo drug, and then they give them an active drug, and then they've negotiated with the drug regulator, hey, this is going to be our outcome. We're looking for less depression as measured on this scale, and we're going to look at it in 500 people, and if we see a difference between drug and placebo, not in 1 study but in 2 studies, then will approve it, and that's all set by precedent usually. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, two's not many at all, right? It's nothing. And they could keep on going until they
But the
find a
other,
second one.
yeah, they can keep on going until they find the second one. And the thing that I think is really important for people to understand is a lot of the times the precedent to get these drugs on the market were short studies, right? And so when Prozac got approved in the early 90s on 8 weeks, that meant that essentially every other antidepressant and SSRI could follow the same path. But these drugs are not used for 2 months. These drugs are used for decades now. And so we don't know much about the safety of these drugs and the effectiveness of these drugs after maybe about 18 months, I think, is some of the longest studies that I've seen with control groups. Most of the people I know are taking them for 5, 10, 20 years. And so it's totally unknown at that point.
Yeah. And I guess it's even more concerning then when we've got the developing minds being prescribed the stimulants or the different types of medications, because I assume that if it's following the same process, then they're short trials as well. And we don't have the long-term outcomes for children into adolescence and then adolescence into adulthood and what that does. And I'm sure you've spoken to people and probably worked with people who have started meds, as a teen or as a young person, possibly. And so I guess, we mentioned at the start, so you set up a clinic in the US with, the goal to de-prescribe, having people come off these meds in a really safe way. So what is what are the common reasons people want to come off these? So what do you see? What are the reactions? What are the results of these meds that has these
Sure.
people want to come off?
Yeah, so I'll just list a couple of them. For a lot of people, the stressor has passed. Some people get put on these meds when they start college away from home because they're having a lot of anxiety, or they go through a divorce or a breakup, or they move towns, and they just get put on them and they just get kind of continued. And then 10 years later, they go, why am I on this thing? And like, why have people kept it going? And so, yeah, the stressor has passed. They don't think they need it anymore. Sometimes they just stop working and they're heading down a dark place. So, you know, like a lot of people might get started on 5 of Lexapro, and then 2 years later they're on 10, 2 years later they're on 15, and then it stops working, then they're on 20. And then all of a sudden the 20 stops working and they're about, 10 years deep on this med. And then the doctor says, well, you've got treatment resistant depression and we should put you on some Seroquel. And then they do some research online and they go, well, I don't want that Seroquel because of all of the weight gain and the tardive dyskinesia, and that's a schizophrenia drug. That's frightening. And so they're coming to the realization that the medications is not really a long-term solution, and that every time you start it, you eventually just hit tolerance and you need to go higher. And they just see that they're just accumulating more and more, and they're not feeling great, and so it's kind of failing. And so I see a lot of people like that as well, who are just like, I don't want this. Unfortunately, I see a lot of people who've been devastated by severe side effects, probably the most common one being protracted withdrawal, which is a uncommon injury that occurs when people rapidly taper off drugs like Xanax or temazepam or Prozac or Lexapro. It's the antidepressants and the sedatives, and it's really neurological damage. And they're in a tremendous amount of pain. They're suffering. It's what happened to Jordan Peterson, if people are aware of that. And so I see people with severe side effects, and I think those are probably the main buckets, like the drug's not working, the drug's causing side effects, or the stressor has passed. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting you say the stressor has passed, right? Which means, I heard you say anyway in the interview, but it's with Dr. McFillin, but medication for just standard life challenges and issues. So I guess what I wanted to chat about then is this numbing effect So how the numbing effect of emotions, the numbing effect that these meds provide, whether you're, I know that parents have shared with me how much their child changes when they're on these stimulants and certain stimulants. And it could be for ADHD. It could be because they've been given a medication for autism or ODD or, there's just so many labels out there that these stimulants would be given, and teens and adults as well. So what is the numbing effect? Why do young people change on these meds, their moods, what they can cope with? Why does that happen?
Why does it happen? So the stimulants, and I guess, and the antidepressants, the stimulants are, at least in children, are fairly well known to be quite, I feel like they can be quite blunting for some kids. They can really zap the creativity from them, and they become more docile and easier to have in a classroom. It's a drug effect, and with the antidepressants, they do the same thing. So, well, in a different way, they really have this mood constricting effect. And I guess the main downside of these things is you don't really, I mean, if these behaviors are coming from genuine things in the person's life, it's almost like, there's smoke in the house and you just turn off the smoke detector, and these things kind of fester and they keep on going. And before you know it, you have a child in their early 20s. Maybe they're on antidepressants, and you may have robbed them of the opportunity to, one, identify that there was something important in their life that needed to be addressed, and then also to develop the emotional skills and regulations to deal with it. And so, I mean, that's not good.
No. And so it kind of leads me into the effect that some of these meds had on you, because I found that so fascinating when you shared that, you experimented with some of these meds. And I loved how you said that, well, if I'm prescribing them, then I better know what it does to me, and I wanted to figure it out. So I think I'd love for everyone to know how it impacted you then, because you really felt the blunting effect, or you really, you felt that and saw how it impacted you, and you had feedback from the people around you. So can you share, why you did it, which ones you took, and I guess the outcome that you saw with those experiments?
Sure. Yeah. So, um, I've taken them therapeutically and I've taken them experimentally. So I'll start with the experiment. So the main one I was interested in was the SSRI. So when I was in training, my wife and I took some of our friends Zoloft. So he just like gave it to us. That's sertraline. And I think my wife almost immediately had a kind of an energized reaction, which she didn't like, which is very common with some of them. And she stopped sleeping and she was a little euphoric, and she just hated it. So I think she lasted about 3 days and just said, "This is not for me." And that's not that uncommon. A lot of people feel that way when they get on them. I tolerated Zoloft pretty well, and I kind of rapidly tapered myself up to about 100 milligrams. And I think I was having the intent, well, what I now understand to be the most common drug effect, which is one of emotional blunting. And I felt pretty dissociated on it, like almost like very kind of calm and a little detached, almost like I was kind of watching my life through a TV screen, And I think that's what happens when your emotions are really turned down. Things just take on this kind of this distant feel. And so I was going to psychiatry residency at the time, and I was, talking to my friends about it, and they were just like, "Yeah, there's something not quite right with you." And I think they were just noticing that I wasn't that spontaneous anymore, and the kind of the abrasive, person that they knew that would kind of call bullshit on a lot of things
Mm.
was gone a little bit. And also my wife, um it became pretty easy actually for me to ignore my wife, and that was the thing that she really hated, because we would be having just regular fights that you would have around the house, and
Mm.
about messes and things like that. And I just remembered how easy it was to just kind of tune that out, and to
Mm.
not be as bothered about it as I used to be. Because
Mm-hmm.
and and I'm going to tell you, I'm like a man, so in general, my volume for like being bothered by things is pretty low sometimes, and I didn't need that turned down any lower, because that
Sure.
I
Especially
need
when
to
it's
work
the
with
house
every.
stuff, right? The house stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And so that was interesting, because it really, there's a Facebook group which I'm in, and I think it's really interesting. It's like marriages destroyed by SSRIs and SNRIs, and
Mm.
I've been in it for a long time, and a lot of the times they talk about how emotional blunting from these meds can be damaging to relationships, because you need a lot of emotional attunement to kind of pick up on when your partner is upset, and to feel it physically, feel the bad emotions, to know, oh my God, I need to go and talk to
Yeah.
them. And when that gets turned down, the relationships start to suffer. And that was definitely something that I was noticing. And I was lucky enough that I was like, yeah, I was expecting this and I could see it. But
Sure.
there's a lot of stories about people who don't notice that that's happening, and then they feel like they've lost their
Mm.
partner.
Sure, I can imagine that would happen quite a lot. And when I hear it from parents, then it has me think, and, correct me if I'm down a wrong path here, but, we have these kids that are having the same effects, right? The emotional blunting, the dissociation, they're a lot more subdued. That's definitely the
Mm-hmm.
feedback that I get. And then we have parents who are really, really upset with them then, because there's no empathy or there's no consideration. So we've got this like backhanded impact for kids and teens who are on the meds. It has the impact of being dissociated, and still the impact of that is really critiqued and criticized, not just from parents but from school systems and from everybody else in their life too. So it's a really hard to see where you can win with that, especially when you're not an educated person like yourself who can understand what's happening to their bodies and to their minds, and can make a decision to come off. It feels quite limited in the decision making in those
Mm-hmm.
arenas.
Yeah, and then I mean, sometimes these kids on stimulants, there's a proportion of them that become irritable, and
Mm.
sometimes disinhibited, and that's another way that they get blamed, when when they get in fights in schools, or when they're nasty to their siblings, or they smash things in the house,
Mm.
and then all of a sudden they end up with a bipolar diagnosis or something like that, and it's like,
Yeah.
could just be the stimulant. Yeah,
Yeah, but that's
yeah.
never spoken about. It's always we come back to the label, right? Because that's the trustworthy source. um
And I mean, Jessica, one of the things that I really worry about, because I mean, I went through school kind of when people were using a lot of Adderall. I'm sure that's still the case today, like just a study. And it's more of this like cultural thing, where I think there's this, I don't know what it is, this, we really value people that go into these kind of white collar professions, where it's like accountant, lawyer, doctor, engineer.
mm,
And then I think for a lot of children, they feel like they need to do that. And then when they hate the subjects at school, they go, I need to drug myself so I can do this. And then so they willingly start taking these stimulants, because they think that they need to get into one of these careers.
mm,
But they may not really be in it, and sometimes the lack of interest in them, it's a genuine lack of interest, just because it's not interesting. It's not interesting for everyone. It's not interesting for all
mm,
types of minds. And
mm,
that also can lead to a bad place later on, because you end up kind of in a career,
mm.
which you're really relying on stimulants to stay engaged in. And uh, that can be really, really tough. to find
And
yourself in that position. Yeah.
yeah, and I feel like, which we haven't seen to the scope of what it will be, but this identity crisis of who am I and what do I really find joyful and fulfilling in my life. And then we, I just don't think we've seen with the generation that we have now, with such high medication, scripts being handed out. I don't think we've seen the repercussions on what that's going to do long term to our population. And I guess then, if from there, I'm curious to hear from you. We've got, because most of these diagnoses and labels are, we can say, social constructs, right? We've mapped in some behaviors and we've put the label on it to try and have people understand what the person is, who they are, and what they're going through, right? So it's very subjective, I feel. It's not objective by any means. So I'm curious, in the years that you've been doing this, what do you think has evolved socially for us to want more of these, diagnoses and answers? One of the things that I heard you speak on was we've got undiagnosed, high levels of misdiagnosed or undiagnosed mental health, right? We need more of it. Not that this is your view, but this is the narrative that comes out, that we have generations where it exists, but nobody was diagnosed, and therefore that's why it was really bad for them. So we need to be vigilant. We need to be diagnosing more so, if anything, to help these people. That's the story that we get fed. So I'm curious to know, from your point of view, why do we need it? What's evolved socially for us to think that this is the best approach?
I think it's I mean, my perspective is that a lot of this is a consequence of again commercial influence from pharmaceutical companies, because there are certain issues, cultural ones, political ones, that drug companies will support. They'll throw huge amounts of money into, and a lot of them are these mental health groups that have these more biological tilts. So I mean, in the US, it's NAMI is the big one. There's Depression Bipolar Support Alliance, I think, and these are the people that are on the radio and that are on shows saying, well, we really need more resources for depression. Depression is a serious medical condition, because, and they refer to it in that way because I guess they're wanting the seriousness that calling something a medical condition carries with it. And so I think drug companies, they help promote these messages, and then also over time they become really these these political things. Hey, we really need to treat depression and anxiety. It's out of control. These are medical problems. And a lot of it comes from, I think, drug companies really promoting those perspectives, and that, I think, that trickles down into our society, and then all of a sudden it just seems like that. How could that not be the case when I hear that on TV and I hear it on the radio and I hear these celebrities talking about, hey, I'm here and I'm talking about how severe depression is. And so you get this one-sided narrative that, depression is on the rise, it's a scourge, it's a serious medical condition, it requires urgent treatment, when maybe the more accurate narrative out there would be something along the lines of depression. It's mostly based on life hardship. We need to support people to identify the real reasons they're depressed. Usually that's not with medication. If you need to use medication, use it carefully, because there's a lot of risks, with it, and they should be used for the shortest amount of time, because that's the accurate narrative. But that's not the one that people hear. They hear the other one, and I think it's very purposeful, that's what people hear.
Sure.
And then when you hear it like that, and there's things happening in your life, and that's what you've heard from your friends and from your school, and there's all of this stuff going on, when things become difficult in your life, that's one way to explain it to yourself. You say, of course I'm doing poorly in school, or this and that, and it could be from things like trauma that are very complicated, but instead of really looking into that, and the effects, you say, well, I guess I have a mental illness. Maybe I have depression because I'm seeing it on TV and I'm seeing it on Twitter, and so I think the ubiquity of how we talk about it really can influence people into how they understand their lives.
Yeah, and I didn't have as much understanding about that aspect until I got into business myself, and granted, obviously not on the scale and with the power and funding as, pharma companies, right? But you really do understand the importance of marketing, and you surround yourself with business people, and they just need to market whatever they're selling. And so it's just another product essentially out there, right? Is what I'm hearing you say. That's their focus. They just need to market. They need to have it be better than the opposing company or the the competition, and that's their world. That's what they're focused on.
And there's like a synergy. I mean, if Pfizer and GSK and Eli Lilly all have SSRIs, it's like if you can almost kind of promote the idea that depression is on the rise and it's a serious medical condition, like two things happen, right? You get kind of you get to be seen as this company that's doing this very honorable thing, really fighting for depression and fighting for the treatment of it. But you also increase your market because this idea gets out there, and so when you have multiple companies doing it together, that can be really powerful.
That's true
Yeah.
too. Yeah, the increase in market is hugely beneficial. I can see that. Yeah. And one of the things which I think is quite relevant to a lot of parents of teens now, especially in young teens, is, and I heard you speaking about it, the idea that some meds can create this, asexual experience or way of being, or development. And so I'm wanting you to explain that a little bit more to our audience, because it is something that I hear parents talking about. The friends at school, they're all talking about this, whatever asexual means to people. I don't even want to delve into the logistics of what that means to each person. But from the medical standpoint, what do you see within this field of it having an impact of being asexual? Can you talk about that for me?
Yeah, and I want to say up front that I know the term asexual can be pretty loaded, and that and it can be an identity for people, and I'm not trying to detract from that. I want to just speak about what I've experienced and what I've seen with these medications, and where these things come from. So SSRIs, all of the antidepressants, apart from kind of Witt-Doerrin, they cause sexual dysfunction. In many ways, it's the most common effect of the drug. It more consistently causes sexual dysfunction than it actually helps with anxiety, and it happens quickly. And so a lot of times people will experience, difficulty getting an erection, and they'll actually lose sexual drive, and they'll lose sexual interest when they're on these medications. And this could be really confusing if you're taking these medications, especially if you're pre-pubescent and you haven't really fully developed sexually. And so one thing that could be very confusing for a young person is to kind of go through their adolescence with a very blunted sexual drive, and to see things happening for their friends, and then just to be like, why am I not interested? Why isn't this happening to me? And so, why aren't I interested sexually in other people? So that's one thing that I see, which I'm worried about. Another thing I see, I work with people who develop PSSD. This is persistent sexual dysfunction after you come off the antidepressants. It's uncommon. If you're taking an antidepressant and listening to this is very likely not going to happen to you. This is a uncommon side effect. But in the people that do experience this, it's bad. They stop the drug and they still feel very, they've lost all sexual interest. And I've had people tell me when they've been suffering from this that they heterosexual men, they've been and they're with a girl that they know logically that they'd find attractive, and they're feeling nothing, and they start to question their sexuality. They start to wonder if they're gay. And just to give you an extent of how confusing it can be when you lose that. And so if we want to bundle all of that into something and say that there's this asexual component that people can start to identify with because of these medications, I think we could use that term. And so I think the antidepressants can cause a lot of confusion for people with their sexual orientation and identity.
Yeah. And again, with the developing mind, we just don't know, right? There's so many unknowns. We don't have the research, and we don't have the science to help us understand what happens to the developing mind with these meds long term.
Some of the stuff is pretty frightening, because there's another guy who I can't remember his name right now, and it's just awful, but he's out of like Massachusetts, and he looks at all the studies of the mice exposed to antidepressants from the mother mouse taking it, and then how their development changes growing up, and the levels of anxiety are higher, and potentially there's I can't remember if we talked about this, but I think there's also some changes in sexual behavior in the mice born to mothers who are on antidepressants. And to what extent that translates to humans, it's unknown, but I mean, it's enough for me to be concerned. And like you said, there's just so many things that we don't know about, what happens, when we have a brain that is maturing, and nervous system maturing, and instead of it being in its kind of unadulterated state, we have a chemical in there that is abnormally increasing the amount of serotonin, or modifying it in an abnormal way. How does that change things for people long term? You'd think that the drug companies would be doing the research and looking into it, but they're not, and that's frightening.
Yeah, and that leads me to wanting to hear from you then. What's the ideal scenario then? So for you, in your line of work, with what you've seen, what's the ideal scenario if someone comes to you and if they did and they said, I'm struggling with this, doc, what do I need, or what should I do? What do you just wish that everybody would consider, know, be told if they are struggling with something, or they don't know what to do?
I mean, I'm going to have a different stance, because than the majority of people. I think you know that, and the viewers are aware of this. I can't in good conscience recommend antidepressants to anyone that's not having the most severe depression or anxiety I've ever seen, because it's just, for me, having seen the things that I've seen, mainly that, the PSSD problems, like the persistent sexual dysfunction, even if this is like a 1 in 5,000 risk or something like that, I don't know the numbers because we don't know them. I mean, 1 in 1,000, 1 in 5,000 risk of having permanent sexual dysfunctions after you stop the drug. That's pretty high, and that's not even to mention the fact that for some people, once they get on them and they've been on them for 6 months, coming off, and for a proportion of people, can just devastate their nervous system to the point where they're suffering greatly. And so, because I know that there can be permanent and serious risks with these medications, I think I would try and support people to do everything in their power to not have to take one of them. And that's really hard, because when you have those conversations, you start talking about financial limitations and things like that. People who have more resources can do more. People who don't, have to, they have to stay alive. And if taking a drug and taking that risk is what you need to do, then that's the right choice for that person at the time. And then you should just continue to help them in every way that you can, so that the time on the drug is the lowest. But I mean, ultimately, that people need to be aware of the risks. You know, they need to know that there's serious ones, they're uncommon, but there's no way of predicting them, and then they need to just make the decision that's right for them.
Mm. And in your view, is it, what has the greater concern or the greatest risk? Is it relationships? Is it our ability to connect with people and what these meds do to our ability to feel, connect, be with people? Or is it the biological stuff that goes on, like what you mentioned with, the serotonin production, and then what that can do? I assume they're interconnected in some way, but what's the greatest risk?
Sure, yeah. The greatest serious risk, I think, like, there's a lot of risks with these drugs, but if you're aware of them, they're not that risky. Like, for instance, if someone tells you that it could potentially cause difficulty in your relationship, you're aware of it, you're monitoring for it, it's fine. If it turns up, you can address it. Some of these drugs make people suicidal. Most doctors warn them about that. Those aren't the risks that I'm worried about because you can recognize them when they turn up. And so the risks that I'm mostly concerned about are the permanent ones, which are unpredictable. And so that's persistent sexual dysfunction. That's the protracted withdrawal injuries that happen when people come off. Um, those ones you can't do anything about, and once they happen, they they change the lives of the sufferers for years. I mean, it's a whole chapter of their life, which is very unpleasant.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So mainly the biological ones. I mean, the other ones, don't get me wrong. Like, if you become manic on an antidepressant and someone misdiagnoses that and you start on antipsychotics and lithium and, your kidneys and your thyroid get taken out, that's really bad. And those things happen to a lot of people. But if you're with someone who's a good doctor and you're informed about the drugs, those things aren't going to happen to you because you'll recognize them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess what we'll end on then is, I guess, what's your hope, Joseph? So what's your, why do you do this work? What's the dream outcome that you're working towards, that you're speaking out on? What do you hope that will become reality for this field of work, this area?
I want doctors and patients and the public just to have um, it's a good question. I mean, I wish there was a better understanding that a lot of these emotional problems that we're having, in fact, the vast majority of them, they're really better dealt with emotional support therapies and social services, helping with things like poverty and access to housing and things like that. I wish that we spent a proportionate amount of money on those problems, but we don't. We focus on the drugs because they're scalable. I wish things could be changed. It's going to sound naive because I know that's never going to happen because drugs are so much more profitable and scalable. But that's really, I mean, we should have an equal amount of economic money and activity spent on that 95% of the problems that we do on those small fraction of
Mm.
things that are biological and really need medication. So I'd like to see that flipped. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And no doubt that's what your practice is doing. So
Yeah.
I thank you so much for joining me here today. Thank you for sharing all of your insider knowledge. And I guess my question is, if anybody wants to work with you, do you work with people internationally? Can they reach out to you, Joseph?
I don't, unfortunately. If
Okay.
you're in Australia, call Dr. Rob Percy, per se, I think he's in Queensland. He's awesome. And in the UK, you get in touch with Mark Horowitz, or in the EU, you might want to see him over there.
Mm-hmm.
I work in a couple states in the US. And my website's Witt-Doerrin psychiatry.com, and it's all listed up there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I know you've got a YouTube channel too. which has a lot of really great, you know, short snippets, easily digestible videos with some information. Is that the best place to go to find out some more information?
Yeah, yeah. If you're kind of resonating with the stuff I'm talking about, or maybe you just want a lot of information on drug tapering, then come to the YouTube channel. It's Dr. Josef. That's Josef. It's the German spelling of the name, and the channel focuses mostly on drug tapering advice, helping people design safe tapers, and then also we do a lot of interviews with people who have been harmed by medications as well to get that word out.
Awesome. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Joseph. It's good to chat with you. And thanks everyone for tuning in.
Jessica, it's been great. Thanks for having me.